Hello there and welcome to the Sleepy Alchemist. Tonight we drift into a world of forest whispers, flickering candlelight, and a woman with a reputation as bright and as misunderstood as the constellations themselves. Picture this, a mossy cottage tucked in the cradle of a pine-covered valley, chimney-curling smoke that smells faintly of lavender and burnt sage. A copper cauldron bubbles gently inside, its contents glowing like embers in the dark. Outside, the townsfolk mutter that she's boiling stars. She isn't, of course. You probably want to know this up front. Stars are terrible at steeping, and frankly, they don't fit in a kettle. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. A long time ago, tucked between the wars and winter plagues of the 12th century, there lived a woman named Miran in a village so small it didn't trouble most maps. She was no one's wife, no one's daughter, at least not anymore. Some said she'd been born under a blood moon, others claimed she came from the east, riding a shaggy goat. In truth, Miran had simply outlived the people who'd ever bothered to record her beginning. What mattered was what she did next. Her cottage squatted at the edge of the forest, slightly crooked, always warm, always damp with steam. Lanterns made from blown glass jars flickered above her workbench. Herbs dangled in great braids from the rafters. Yarrow, chamomile, foxglove, if you were nosy. She wore dark blue dresses stained with 100 tinctures, and a belt heavy with tiny tools, a pestle shaped like a bishop's nose, a bundle of reeds hollowed for precise pouring, and tiny shears with blades like dragonfly wings. By day, she listened. Villagers came to her hunched and coughing, limping with wounds or swollen with mystery ailments. She didn't chant or mutter in tongues. Instead, she listened to the way breath rattled in chests, the way eyes dulled or skin flushed. Then she'd reach for a jar or 5 and begin the patient work of healing. Her nickname, the one who boils stars, came from what they saw through her windows, eerie lights dancing in her cauldron. In reality, it was often just bioluminescent eel oil she mixed with crushed cinnabar, useful for spotting fungal rot in bones, not summoning comets. Mirowin's knowledge went far beyond the kitchen cures of other wise women. She'd once travelled as far as Marseille with a merchant caravan and returned, not with silks or salt, but scrolls. One of them contained early Arabic translations of Hippocrates' texts. She kept it wrapped in waxed linen beneath her floorboards. And while it's true that most women in her time practiced healing in secret or shadow, Merwin operated openly, if cautiously. After all, the church frowned on unlicensed healers, particularly women, but her reputation for effectiveness had earned her a grudging space just outside both law and legend. Every year, at Candlemas, the villagers brought her offerings, not gold, but clay pots, river stones, or beeswax candles. She asked no fees. Her payment was trust and total silence about what they saw or heard in her home. And so she healed a broken leg with willow bark compresses and a careful splint carved from alder branches. She soothed dying lungs with licorice root tea and garlic poultices. She even revived a near-drowned boy with rhythmic thumps to the chest, a method historians still argue whether originated from Arabian texts or some ancient Etruscan seafarer's instinct. One evening during the spring bloom, she stood outside gathering magnolia petals in a shallow wooden bowl. Their fragrance was sharp, almost lemony, good for fevers when steeped in wine and mixed with vinegar. She crushed one between her fingers, breathing in its perfume. Behind her, a hedgehog rustled in the underbrush, and the brook chuckled over smooth stones. It should have been a peaceful moment. But Miran felt it. The air had shifted. A tension, like when a storm begins building behind the trees, slow and secretive. Something or someone was watching her. Now, here's a little fringe tidbit for you. In the 1100s, it wasn't uncommon for travelling monks to spy on suspected heretics under the guise of collecting herbs. So-called brothers of the leaf were known to carry satchels of nettle and mint, but record secrets for bishops. So when she turned and saw no one, she whispered a protective chant, not magic per se, but a memory, No root shall rot, no brew shall sour, if fire and water hold equal power. It was her grandmother's rhyme, more rhythm than ritual, but it settled her nerves. That night, as the moon crept behind clouded lace, Moraine boiled a salve of linden marshmallow root and bear's grease. She stirred with a bone spoon, careful not to let the mixture scald. The light it gave off was warm, a soft amber. Through the fogged glass of her windows, it looked quite honestly like she'd trapped a constellation in a pot. A dog barked once from the village, then silence. She didn't know it yet, but beyond the hills, a royal horseman had just collapsed from exhaustion. He bore a scroll sealed with crimson wax and the king's own crest. It had one name written on it, Muraman of Elthing Fen. The illness he carried news of would not be soothed by magnolia petals, and soon the woman who boiled stars would find herself in a palace of marble and whispers, where the sick didn't smell of pine bark and peat smoke, but of expensive oils and dying privilege. The village of Elthing Fen had always leaned on Merewyn like an old stool, wobbly but dependable. People came to her with every ill imaginable: aching joints, poisoned wounds, colicky babies, and the occasional sheep that seemed possessed, but was usually just bloated from overfeeding. They whispered about her cures in the same breath as their prayers, unsure if they were pious or damned for trusting her. Merewyn never promised miracles. She promised observation. She kept notes scrawled on parchment made from boiled animal skin, its texture more like old bark than paper. They were encoded, not for secrecy, but to keep prying eyes from butchering her Latin and jumping to ridiculous conclusions, like the time a visiting friar saw a belladonna and demanded to know why she trafficked with demons. It was just nightshade for dilating pupils. Calm down, Brother Edgar. That day, after her eerie moonlit salve-making, the first villager to appear was the blacksmith's daughter. The girl was sunburned and feverish. Her lips cracked like kiln-fired clay. Mirren looked her over with a practiced eye, touching her wrist, tilting her face toward the light. "Too much time in the south fields," she muttered, opening a jar of thick violet paste. "This will sting, like kissing a wasp." She gently smeared it across the girl's lips, explaining the ingredients as she always did: comfrey, beeswax, goose fat, and a few drops of something she only called moonbite, which might have been mint or something far rarer. The girl nodded, trusting, eyes wide. You see, in the medieval world, healers were often measured by how memorable their mixtures smelled. Garlic and honey, honest. Sulphur and deer brain, questionable. Merewyn walked a fine line. Her salves tingled, but they worked. And yet, despite her talents, there were lines she never crossed. She wouldn't cure a soldier's infected blade wound if he'd spilled blood on holy ground. She wouldn't help a man who beat his wife, though she'd quietly leave herbs for the woman under the chapel's loose stone. And she wouldn't fake a cure just to soothe a rich man's pride. Historians still argue whether Merewyn learned her science from travelling Moorish apothecaries, or had simply experimented endlessly until nature whispered back. What's more likely is a bit of both. Her cottage was a collage of knowledge: Greek scrolls beside druid charms, pestles carved with Norse runes grinding plants from Italian coastlines. That morning a rumour drifted in with the wind, carried by a travelling weaver who stopped by for dried valerian. He spoke in hushed tones about the royal prince. The boy was deathly ill, said the weaver, and none of the king's famed physicians could explain it. Some blamed a curse, others whispered poisoning. Mirren paused while grinding mugwort. And how does a weaver know court secrets? He leaned in. My cousin works the kitchens. She says the prince hasn't set opened his eyes in a fortnight. Breath shallow, skin pale, no mark on him. That part made Merewyn pause. No mark? She echoed. The weaver nodded, eyes darting. They say his body sips perfect, like he sips sleeping. But he don't sit wake, and the king he sips desperate. Later she sat at her workbench, the mortar silent before her. She stared into the fibres of a dried moss she'd been crumbling and thought, not like a healer, but like a scholar, an unmarked boy in a deep unconscious state, declining steadily, with no visible symptoms, no rash, no trauma, no swelling. Poison was possible, but so was a fever missed in its early stages, a blocked humoral flow, or, her breath caught, contaminated compounds in his food or drink. The rich had peculiar diets, full of undercooked game and questionable imports. It wasn't unheard of for spices preserved in lead-tin jars to turn toxic over time. The problem was, none of this was her concern, or so she thought. That night, as she sorted dried angelica root by candlelight, the knock came. Not a knock, really, more like a command wrapped in velvet. 3 raps, slow and deliberate. When she opened the door, a hooded figure stood in the mist, horse snorting behind him. His boots were polished, his gloves finer than anyone in Elthing Fen could afford. The scroll he handed her bore the royal crest, its wax seal intact. She unrolled it, reading quickly. The handwriting was angular and clean, betraying a scribe's training. At its core, an order, not a request. Her presence was required at the royal court, under penalty of land seizure, to consult on a matter of grave medical urgency. She looked up. "And if I refuse?" The messenger tilted his head slightly. "Then the king will ask again, louder, and perhaps with soldiers." She exhaled slowly through her nose, folding the scroll. Her hands didn't shake, but inside her, a knot had begun to twist. This wasn't a patient wandering in with bruised ribs or a merchant with sour stomach. This was power, pressure, scrutiny. Still, curiosity was a fire in her belly. 3 days, she said. "I still need to gather tools, dried roots, sealed compounds." "You still have one," the messenger replied. And with that, he turned and vanished into the fog. The next morning, Mirren packed what she could. She kissed the doorway of her home, not from sentiment but tradition. The Fenfolk believed spirits guarded thresholds, and you always thanked them before a journey. As she mounted the royal horse left for her, one last thought flitted through her mind. If they think I boil stars, wait until they see what happens when I distill truth. The path ahead led through towns she'd only seen on crude maps, toward a palace gleaming with marble and fear, toward a boy who might be dying because no one had dared look past tradition and title, and toward a court not ready for a woman who read plants like books and bodies like prayers. The journey to the royal court was not the romantic kind told in bardic song. It was damp, long, inconvenient. The horse assigned to Merowyn, an impressively groomed grey gelding named, according to his tack, Sir Balthus, had no patience for her saddle packs or the pungent herbal bundles that clinked with every step. He snorted often and twice tried to chew through her fennel pouch. By the second day, Merowyn's thighs ached. Her hair was tangled from wind and river mist, and she deeply regretted not bringing more goose grease for the chafing, but she pressed on, chewing strips of dried apple and muttering plant names to herself to keep the rhythm. As the woods thinned and the roads grew wider, the signs of royalty emerged like gilded breadcrumbs. Smooth cobblestones replaced mud, rows of fastidiously pruned hawthorn lined the path, and finally, looming out of morning fog, the royal palace, vast, white-stoned and absurdly clean. It looked like it had never known rain. 2 guards greeted her at the gate, one young and eager, the other older and distinctly allergic to conversation. They checked the scroll, narrowed their eyes at her jars and bundles, and wordlessly escorted her across a courtyard where fountains trickled and silk-clad nobles avoided eye contact. Inside, the air was strangely still. No children playing, no dogs barking, just candlelight flickering against polished stone and the faint scent of myrrh. A footman led her through a series of corridors until they reached a room that was warm, dim, and silent as a crypt. The prince lay in the centre. He was no child, this heir, 18, perhaps 19 summers, bare-chested, under linen sheets, skin pale as bleached parchment, lips tinged blue, chest rising in soft, irregular pulses. A physician stood nearby, plump and sour-faced, arms crossed with the authority of someone used to unquestioned command. "You stir the herb woman," he said without looking at her. "You will not touch the prince without my permission." "Touching," Merowyn replied, unbothered, "is hardly my first step." She circled the bed slowly, examining. The prince's nails were ridged, a telltale sign of long-term deficiency. His pupils reacted to light, but sluggishly, no rashes, no swelling in the joints. His breath held a faintly sweet metallic edge. That made her pause. She turned to the physician. "What have you fed him?" "Broths. Barley wine. A touch of poppy syrup for sleep." "How much barley wine?" The physician bristled. "What does it matter? The finest barley in the land." Marinin nodded, just once. "That sip's what I feared." Here's your historical fun fact for the night. In medieval Europe, barley was often stored in wooden casks sealed with pitch or wax, but the truly fine batches, those were preserved in glazed ceramic containers lined with lead. Delicious, decorative, and occasionally lethal when acidic wine drew out the toxins. Mirin didn't accuse. Not yet. She simply pulled a pouch from her satchel and began crushing charcoal into powder. "This will draw impurities," she murmured. "I sipp'll need boiled water, not well water boiled, and a cup that sips never seen metal." The physician scoffed. "Charcoal? Are we summoning demons or brewing breakfast?" She didn't answer. She was focused, face calm but eyes sharp. She poured the charcoal into a clay dish and added dried fenugreek and a pinch of dried magnolia. To the watching nobles, it looked like a spell. In truth, she was crafting a primitive chelating agent, a compound that could, in theory, bind with heavy metals in the body and help flush them out. It wasn't a guaranteed cure, but it was a start. That's the thing about Maren, she didn't know if it would work. She understood why it might. Her science was patient, curious, built on years of observation and failure. Historians still argue whether she was the first in the British Isles to identify lead poisoning. There are accounts of Roman medics observing similar symptoms, but none linking them to contaminated drink. Merwin may not have had the language of molecules, but she had patterns, she had time. She administered the black brew with a clay spoon, careful not to spill. Then she waited, and listened, and noted. The Prince Sector's breath deepened. Not healed, but eased. That night, she was offered a guest chamber with thick rugs and a canopied bed she couldn't bear to lie in. Instead, she sat cross-legged on the floor, scribbling notes by candlelight. She encoded everything: pulse rate, breath sounds, the precise ratio of charcoal to magnolia. She didn't sleep. The next morning, whispers chased her down the corridor. Servants peered from behind curtains. A footman offered to carry her satchel, eyes wide. "What did you do?" he whispered. "I told the stars to wait," she muttered dryly. In truth, she'd done what the court's finest physicians had not listened to the boy's breath. He tasted his sweat, smelled his exhale. But already, rumours bloomed like mould in a damp cellar. Some said she'd poured starlight into his mouth. Others swore they'd seen the prince glow faintly in the candlelight. By afternoon, the court physician had cornered her in the herbarium. "You defy protocols," he hissed. "The prince is not a toy." "No," Mirin replied. "He sips a puzzle." "And what happens when your tricks fail?" "They're not tricks," she said, and stepped past him. Because deep inside she knew this was only the beginning. The charcoal would hold the symptoms at bay, but if the barley wine had poisoned him, other compounds could still be in his blood. She needed more information, more time, and a way to prove to these velvet-cloaked doubters that science wasn't heresy, and that knowledge, even in a woman's hands, could save a kingdom. Somewhere beneath this palace, secrets were fermenting, and she intended to boil them to the surface. The palace corridors were a different kind of forest, dim, echoing, and full of things that could stalk you without ever showing a face. The walls whispered more than the wind ever had in Elthing Fen. Every embroidered curtain seemed to have ears, and every servant moved like a shadow with selective memory. Maren, of course, heard it all, the murmurs, the doubt. She boiled something black and fed it to him. "They say she dances under the moon and talks to crows. My cousin swears her eyes glow when she stirs her pot." The court had always had a taste for theatrics, and if they wanted mystery, Maren was inclined to give them mystery, so long as they let her work. She drifted through the palace like smoke, all silent steps and scent of crushed herbs. Even when she passed gilded mirrors, she barely left a reflection, just the way she liked it. But word of the Prince Sip's first stirrings had begun to spread beyond idle gossip. Nobles who once ignored her now leaned closer when she passed. A young scribe offered her fig cakes. A visiting duchess asked too casually if she could peek at Mirawen Sip's little spells. They set not little, Mirin replied, and they set are not yours. She didn't trust them, but she watched them closely. That Sips when the first strange thing happened. One of the kitchen boys, barely more than 12, ears like half-folded pastries, slipped her a note folded into a dried lavender sachet. It read, "Is Sips not the first? Ask the brewer." No name, no signature, just the scent of lavender and panic. She burned the note in her chamber, heart ticking faster than usual. If the prince wasn't the first, that meant this wasn't just misfortune, it was pattern. Someone, somewhere, had seen what she was only beginning to suspect. So she took a stroll. You see, the palace brewery wasn't located in the palace itself. Too many smells, too many accidents. It sat near the lower grounds behind the stable blocks, in a squat stone building that reeked of yeast and pride. The brewer, Master Jorik, was a wide-shouldered man with fingers the size of sausage rolls and a nose broken more than once. She found him mid-barrel stirring mash that steamed like a dragon's sigh. "I set 'em told," she said casually, "that your barley is the best in the kingdom." Jorik puffed up, won the King Sep's gold spoon 3 years running, and its set stored in, glazed amphore, imported from Provence, finest ware for finest stock. Of course it was, and therein lay the danger. She leaned over the open mash vat, inhaled. It smelled right, malty, slightly sharp, but something lingered beneath, a faint sourness, metallic and wrong. "Have there been other illnesses?" she asked carefully. "Strange ones, subtle." Jorik frowned. "A few, couple of scullery lads got tremors. The Queen Sept's falconer, too. Had to give up the birds, couldn't Sept keep his hands steady. But nothing royal." He looked at her then, eyes narrowing. "You think it's Sips, my brew?" "I think," she said softly, "your containers may be poisoning your customers." He didn't take it well. That Sipt's foreign clay, fired with alpine ash, and triple glazed, it Sept's the best money can buy. "Yes," Maren said, "and sometimes, the more expensive the mistake, the less anyone wants to see it." Historical fact for you, lead-based glazes were all the rage in elite medieval kitchens. Shiny, smooth, and deeply toxic. Potters used them liberally, especially for preserving wine and ale. But acidic contents, like barley wine or vinegar, drew the lead out like honey from a hive. Merwin asked for a sample, and grudgingly, Jorik obliged. She tucked the tiny flask into her satchel and left without a word. Back in her chamber, she prepared a test. She scraped shavings from the inside of one of her iron spoons, dropped them into a small bowl with the barley wine, and added a solution of boiled vinegar and wormwood. If her guess was right, the mixture turned cloudy. Lead, definitely. She leaned back and exhaled. So, the prince was ill, not by curse or dagger, but by a slow, shining poison served with affection. Every goblet of health, every celebratory toast, it all shimmered with death. But what to do with that knowledge? She couldn't accuse the brewer without proof that would withstand scrutiny. She needed someone who understood the stakes, someone powerful enough to shield her, and someone not already half dead from drinking the same brew. That's when she remembered the scrolls in the palace library. Earlier she'd glimpsed it in passing, a dimly lit annex smelling of mildew and ambition, tucked away behind the great chapel, guarded by a scribe who thought women couldn't read unless they wore spectacles and had 2 chins. Mirin had neither, but she had resolve. That night, she slipped in with a wax tablet, a tallow candle, and her memory. She found what she needed quickly. A chronicle from 28 winters ago. A description of the Black Breath, an illness that left the eldest prince and uncle long forgotten comatose for weeks before mysteriously vanishing from public record. According to the scroll, the boy had loved a particular sweet barley cordial brewed during the summer festivals. Mirin felt the shiver in her spine again, the same patterns, the same poison, rewritten as plague, blamed on sorcery, buried under ceremony. Historians still argue whether medieval rulers intentionally erased embarrassing illnesses from the record or simply refused to name causes they didn't understand. But Merwin understood all too well. History only remembers what power permits. And in this case, the truth was being crushed under the weight of ignorance and prestige. She exited the library quietly, locking eyes briefly with a tall shadow at the corridor's edge. For a moment she swore it moved, then it vanished. Someone was watching her. Someone who didn't want stars boiled or truths uncovered. The next morning broke not with sunlight, but with the cold clarity of confrontation. Merwin was summoned to the Queen's antechamber before she'd finished grinding her rootstock for the day's tinctures. Not that she would have refused the summons, not openly, but something about the footman's tight jaw and refusal to meet her eye said this wasn't a request wrapped in silk. The Queen's chamber was less a room and more a strategy, a long arc of windows, crushed velvet drapes, and enough incense to drown a confessional. At its centre sat Queen Isolde, dressed in mourning black despite no declared loss. Her gaze was fixed and unreadable, like an ivory mask that had forgotten how to be human. Next to her stood a familiar figure, the court physician, still puffed up like a peacock with indigestion. "You will explain," the Queen said simply. "No greetings, no title, just that." Merwin bowed, barely. "Explain what, Your Majesty?" The physician interjected, his voice a strained falsetto of outrage. "That you sit been administering unknown substances to His Highness, outside any sanctioned protocol, that your remedies are unrecorded, undocumented, and possibly dangerous." Merwin raised one eyebrow. "So is your barley wine. Shall we talk danger?" The Queen's expression didn't change, but a faint tilt of her head suggested intrigue, if not amusement. "What exactly have you discovered?" she asked. "Lead," Merwin said plainly, "drawn into the wine from the storage amphorae, is stitched slow, invisible, and fatal over time. The prince isn't sect cursed, he sits poisoned by tradition. You could have heard a pin drop, or a physician's pride shattering on the floor. Now here's something worth noting. In the 12th century, the connection between lid and illness was barely understood in Western Europe. The Romans had suspicions, sure. Pliny the Elder warned about sweet-tasting water pipes, but most believed bad air or imbalance of the four humours was to blame. Merwin, as usual, was ahead of her time and miles out of favour. The Queen leaned back, fingers steepled. "And you can treat this?" "I can stabilise him," Merwin said. "But it won't set be theatrical. It will take time and careful correction of humoral imbalance. Yes, but also diet, charcoal infusions, and a complete cessation of the contaminated wine, which half the court drinks," the Queen murmured, "including me." That hung in the air like thick incense. "You realise," she added softly, "that if you shet wrong, and this is witchcraft or sabotage, you will be executed." Merwin nodded. "And if I sipped 'em right?" Then the Queen said, "You sit'll be inconvenient, but alive." There it was, the royal offer, a blade wrapped in velvet. As she was dismissed, the court physician glared daggers at her back. Merwin didn't flinch. She was used to suspicion. What unnerved her was something else entirely. The tall shadow she kept catching at the edge of her vision. Someone had followed her again last night, footprints in the corridor dust. A candle snuffed when she passed. She wasn't sit, just watched. She was being measured. Later that day, a note appeared beneath her bowl of crushed thyme. No wax seal, just plain parchment, smelling faintly of ink and inkberry juice. "You think you're the only one who sees it. You're not. Meet me by the southern conservatory when the bells strike 8. Come alone." She burned this note too. At dusk, when the castle shifted into that eerie silence just before sleep, Merwin slipped down the servant passageways and into the conservatory, a glass-domed marvel filled with orchids, and more orchids. Some bloomed with bright colours not native to this climate, imports from Sicily and beyond. Waiting in the shadows was a boy no older than 16, draped in stable-hand rags, but with eyes too alert for his pay grade. "I wrote the notes," he said simply. "I figured. My mother used to work in the outer kitchens. Died last winter. Same symptoms. Shaking, slurred words. Sleep she never woke from. Nobody cared, just said she had the wasting." Maria nodded, heart tightening. "I cleaned up after the falconer too. He drank from the same cask as the prince. And no one noticed. Noticed? Yes. Admitted? No. They buried it. Same as they always do. That sip's why I left the note. You actually look. Why trust me? Because you scare them, and because you sit not from here. A strange alliance, then a boy with dirt under his nails, and a healer with lead on her hands. She gave him a task to watch, to listen, to bring her anything strange, discarded goblets, stories, names whispered behind hands. And in return she gave him a small pouch. Crushed garlic, charcoal, dried chicory root. Brew it in wine and drink a thimble each morning. It won't fix everything, but it may slow the damage. He looked at her as if she'd handed him a kingdom, and just like that, the game deepened. Historians still argue whether this alliance between peasant and alchemist was the turning point in Merowyn's story. Some call it foolish sentiment. Others say it was the smartest move she made. After all, information is the currency of courts, and she just gained a steady supply. That night, Merowyn sat in her chamber, writing furiously. Not spells, not incantations, just ratios, symptoms, test results, scribbled in a code of her own making, but one word stood out, written 3 times in quick succession. Proof, proof, proof. Because in this place miracles meant nothing without documentation, and science, her kind of science, was still viewed with suspicion, unless it could be dressed in velvet and crowned with incense. She would give them a show, if needed. She'd boil stars if it meant buying time. But soon she need more than tricks. She need an ally with a title, and those were the rarest of all ingredients. The next morning, the sun broke through in ribbons, slicing the mist like a blade, but the palace never quite felt warm. It was the kind of place where even light felt watched. Merowyn stood in the herbarium, cauldron bubbling low with a syrup-thick tincture of cleavers and liverwort. Not flashy, not fragrant, but it was the kind of brew that scrubbed the body clean from the inside out. She stirred slowly, wrist aching from lack of sleep, eyes darting toward the heavy wooden door. She wasn't waiting for trouble. She was waiting for an opportunity. By midday it came in the form of Lady Selwyn of Castamere, a pale bird-like woman known less for her fashion and more for her unfortunate habit of fainting in public. Merowyn had watched her flutter through halls for days, always clutching a lace-trimmed kerchief and sighing like a leaky bellows. Today, however, Lady Selwyn arrived with a mission. "I require a tincture for feminine discomfort," she whispered dramatically, "and I do mean feminine." Merowyn, not missing a beat, handed her a vial of raspberry leaf, licorice, and a few drops of something she didn't Take 3 drops before the moon rises, and avoid wine. Lady Selwyn blinked. Avoid? That seems excessive. If you'd like to keep fainting, by all means. And just like that, the lady flitted off in a huff, but not before catching the eye of a young courtier by the name of Sir Thalion. Now, he was what Merowyn had really been watching for. Thalion was the king's 5th cousin by way of a long-forgotten sibling, and had precisely the right combination of charm, curiosity, and political expendability. He also had a fondness for oddities, including the occasional philosophical discussion with the Star Boiler, as he'd come to call her. That afternoon, he cornered her in the cloistered corridor near the tapestry of St. Jude's improbable rescue from a dragon. "I hear you got Lady Selwyn breathing fire," he grinned, leaning against the stone. "Careful, she faints near powerful women." Merowyn didn't smile. "She sips not my concern." "Then what is?" he asked, genuinely curious. "If you've been flitting about like a crow at a feast, brewing things, testing walls with your nose." She considered her answer, then decided to gamble. "Tell me, Sir Thalion, have you had the barley wine lately?" His smile faltered just enough. "Not since Candlemas," he admitted. "It made my teeth ache." "Why?" She leaned in. "I believe it's been poisoned. Slowly, unintentionally, but poisoned nonetheless." Thalion frowned, thoughtfully now. "That's an accusation." "It's a hypothesis," she corrected, "backed by tests, symptoms, and a not insignificant number of twitching hands and dulled minds." To his credit, he didn't scoff. Instead, he looked around and lowered his voice. "Come to my chambers tonight, after second bell, Bring your evidence. It wasn't quite an alliance, but it was a hinge, and Merowyn knew how to work a hinge until it opened into a door. That evening she packed a small kit, powdered lead test, barley wine sample, 2 vials of her most dramatic-looking infusions for flair, and a sliver of parchment bearing coded notes. When she arrived at Thalion's quarters, surprisingly modest for a noble, he waved her in with a grin. "I'm told this is the part where I offer you a glass of wine," he teased. "Only if you want to forget your name." She laid out the materials with the precision of a surgeon. He watched as she added crushed vinegar root to the wine and stirred it with a pin scraped from the bottom of her own iron cauldron. Within moments, the liquid clouded. "Lead oxide," she said simply. "The glaze on the amphorae has begun to leach. Enough of this, and even a prince Sipsa's blood turns thick with sleep." Thalion's face went still. No jokes, no flirtations. "You stir saying this isn't sit. New. I sit saying this is old," she said. "Decades old. The last outbreak was written off as a mystery illness. The same pattern, the same drink." He sat down, hard. "My uncle drank from that cask before he lost the use of his legs. They blamed a fall." Meryn nodded. "They always blame something else, until the rot becomes impossible to bury." For a long moment they sat in silence. Then Thalion did something unexpected. He reached for the wine. "Not to drink," he said quickly, catching her alarm. "To test. With you. If I bring this forward, it won't sit be your word against theirs. It sit be ours." She blinked. "An ally with a title. Well, what do you know? Here's your quirky tidbit for the night. Medieval courts often ignored female testimony in scientific matters, unless it was bolstered by male endorsement or sufficiently cloaked in divine providence. A nobleman's support could mean the difference between miracle and accusation. And so she walked him through the test. Twice. Then showed him the scroll from the archive, the symptoms in the prints, the records of the falconer, and when he asked, the coded notebook. He couldn't read it, but the sheer density impressed him. "I don't vote understand half of this," he admitted. "But it sips clear you do." She felt a strange tightness in her chest. Gratitude, maybe, or the terrifying weight of hope. "Will you take this to the king?" she asked. Thalion hesitated. "Not yet. Not without something the court can ignore. Give me 2 days, and keep him alive." That last part was a dagger wrapped in silk, because the prince's fever had begun to rise again. The charcoal tincture bought time, but not cure. She needed a new solution. As she left Thalion's quarters, the night air pressed heavy with fog. In the distance, a dog barked once, sharply, and across the garden, just beneath the eastern window of the prince's tower, she saw a flicker of movement, a figure in black slipping away, fast and quiet. Not a servant, not a thief, a spy. Someone else was circling the same truths, perhaps for darker reasons. And Merwyn realized it wasn't just about curing a prince anymore. It was about surviving what happened after. The prince's chamber smelled of wilted roses and stale breath. Candles lined every windowsill like little sentinels, flickering against the pale hush of dying royalty. Merowyn entered just after sunrise, her boots quiet on the marble. The chambermaid on duty gave her a wary look before slipping out, grateful to be rid of the burden. Meryn didn't waste time with pleasantries. She moved to the prince's bedside and placed her fingertips gently on his neck, feeling for the rhythm. The pulse was thin, fast, like a rabbit under snow. Sweat pooled at his temples. His skin had lost its color again, ashen, with that same faintly metallic sheen around his lips. The barley wine had been removed 2 days ago, on her instruction, but withdrawal wasn't simple. The poison might have stopped entering his body, but it still clung to his blood, to his bones. She needed to draw it out, and fast. She reached into her satchel and drew out 3 pouches, dried burdock, a thumb-length stick of licorice root, and something rarer, a coarse brown lichen she'd collected from the northern cliffs of Caerbranach years ago. The lichen had no name in Latin or courtly speech. In her grandmother's tongue it was called star feather. Fringe tidbit for the night. While seldom used in Western medicine, certain lichens contain chelating compounds, molecules that can bind to heavy metals in the body and drag them out like reluctant ghosts. Ancient Norse healers swore by it. Mirowin had tested it only once. On a crow. The crow survived. Barely. This wasn't sit a crow, but she had no choice. She ground the mix with a splash of ox bile to thin the potion, then stirred it into a mug of warm oat milk, sweetened with honey to blunt the bitterness. The result was an ugly grey liquid that smelled faintly of moss and despair. Moraine bent close to the Prince Sept's ear. "Wake now," she whispered. "Not for me, for yourself. The world is sharp, yes, but your bones are made of stars, and I sit not ready to watch them fall." He didn't move. She tilted his head carefully, and with a narrow horn spoon dribbled the potion between his lips. Drop by drop, the body swallowed reflexively, a hopeful sign. Then came the wait. She sat beside him, silent but not still, fingers twitching with the need to do, to stir, to work. But she couldn't push this brew, it either worked or it didn't. Her hands found her notebook, and she began to scrawl observations in shorthand. Pulse after potion, 112. Breathing shallow, irregular. Pupil reaction, slow but not unresponsive. Then came the sound. A groan, soft, barely audible. She looked up, heart in her throat. The Prince Sip's fingers twitched. She stood, leaning over him. "Come on, keep going." His eyes flickered, and for the first time in 21 days, Prince Aldrich opened his eyes. Clouded, unfocused, but open. A whisper escaped his cracked lips. It wasn't a full word, but the shape of it suggested recognition. His gaze rolled toward her, confused, dazed. Mirwin exhaled, slow and trembling, and sat down before her knees gave out. She didn't shout for the guards. Not yet. Instead, she reached for his hand and held it gently. "You seven gone a while," she murmured. "But you sever back now. We sever not done with you." It took the castle a full hour to realize he was awake. By the time the guards called the Queen, and the Queen summoned her entire bejeweled entourage of advisors, scholars, and religious handlers, Merin had already left the prince's side. She stood in the corner, watching the show unfold. The Queen fell to her knees beside the bed, tears slipping down her powdered face. The High Almoner muttered prayers in Latin. The court physician hovered like a moth around a candle he couldn't understand. "His eyes are open," someone gasped. He tried to speak. "St. Jude, preserve us." Merwin resisted the urge to roll her eyes. They clutched their rosaries and muttered about miracles. But when the Queen's eyes met hers across the crowded room, there was no mistaking the truth between them. This wasn't sit divine. This was work. Science, a woman's work done quietly in the shadows with jars and plants and unglamorous tools. The Queen stood, composed herself, walked directly to Merwin. "He lives," she said simply. Merwin nodded, for now. "And the poison. I stopped it from killing him. That sept's all." The Queen studied her for a moment. "What do you need?" "Time, and no interference." "And if the court objects?" Mirumantiasum's mouth quirked. "Then I sit till boil something flashier next time." The Queen almost smiled. Almost. Later that evening, when the great court dinner was underway, a feast thrown in muted celebration of the prince's awakening, Mirin sat alone in the herbarium, replenishing her stock. There was a quiet knock at the door. It was Thalion. "You did it," he said, entering and closing the door softly behind him. "We did," she corrected. "You gave me space. That counts." He leaned against the wall, arms folded. "You sips made the rest of us look quite foolish. Not my fault if your best minds can tell poison from port." He laughed. A quiet, honest thing. "You sipped are dangerous when you sipped are right." "I sip's always dangerous," she replied. He grew serious. "They sit'll come for you, you know. Not with swords, with questions, demands. They sit'll want your secrets. They always do. Can you protect them?" She looked up, the candlelight catching the smudge of lichen on her cheek. "That depends. Can you give me something stronger than secrecy?" He considered, then nodded. "Tomorrow, I sit'll speak to the archivist. If you want official recognition, I sit'll push for it." Mirowin Sict's eyes narrowed. "Recognition isn't sict what I want." Then what? She hesitated, then whispered, permission to keep doing what I do. Without permission, they still call it witchcraft. With it, they still call it science. He understood. As he left, he said only one thing, sleep tonight. You sip, earned it. But Mirin didn't sleep, because beneath her fingers the prince's pulse had changed again, stronger now, but uneven. Something deeper stirred beneath the lead, something unrelated. Something she hadn't seen yet. And the stars, it seemed, were still boiling. It began with leeches. 5 of them, fat, glossy, and very much alive, squirming in a silver dish beside the prince's bed the next morning. Marine stared at them with a kind of weary disbelief. She hadn't summoned them, and she certainly hadn't prescribed them. A servant, pale and flustered, pointed toward the foot of the bed. The physician, he said in a whisper. He said it standard, to draw out the sickness. Mirwin scoffed and plucked the dish from the stand, carrying it like one might carry a sleeping ferret with a thirst for faces. Take these, she told the servant, and release them in the fish pond, before they develop a taste for heir to the throne. By the 12th century, leeching was firmly entrenched in European medicine, based on Galen's ancient theories of balancing the 4 humours, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Leeches were thought to draw out excess blood, curing everything from gout to melancholy. Never mind that it rarely worked. Never mind that most leech-based treatments resulted in fatigue, infection, or, more often than not, death. But the court physician, Master Egelric, was nothing if not a disciple of convention. He arrived moments later, robe flapping, breath huffing like a disgruntled bellows. You dare interfere with my treatment? Mirren didn't look up from her notes. Your treatment involves weakening an already poisoned boy with parasitic slugs. Forgive me if I didn't see the benefit. Egelric Sect's face flushed crimson. You presume much, Hedgewitch. Which implies supernatural knowledge, she replied, dipping her quill. I septum just literate. That last bit hit a nerve. Egelric sputtered something unintelligible, likely invoking the names of half the saints, before storming out in a flurry of sanctimonious silk. Myron made a note in the Prince Sep's chart. Leech incident. No change in pulse, +1 pompous fury. She wasn't afraid of Egelric. Not exactly. But his reach was long, and his alliances deeper than any roots she knew. A single accusation of sorcery could land her in the stocks. Or worse, she needed to tread carefully, now that the prince was improving. Still, something nagged at her. The prince had spoken the night before, not a full sentence, but a slurred collection of syllables that sounded suspiciously like copper taste. It aligned with what she suspected, that the wine hadn't just been tainted by lead, but something else, something metallic and far less predictable. She sat with him again, holding his hand and whispering names of herbs, watching his eyelids flutter in time with his pulse. You've not done speaking yet, she said, so let's find out what thit's still silencing you. As she examined his mouth, she caught it, a faint discoloration along his gums, blue-grey, like tarnished silver. Lead, certainly, but not just lead. She scribbled the note, then added another, request access to the wine cellar. Need to inspect L. amphorae. When she submitted the request, it was denied within the hour. Apparently wine cellars were considered sacred ground by the royal sommelier, and by sacred, they meant you're not a noble, stay out. So she found another way in. A friendly bribe to the scullery boy, a second to the laundress who knew the back corridors, and before long, Mirowin found herself in a vaulted stone chamber, cold and shadowed, lined wall to wall, with ceramic jugs and casks of varying origin. She lit a taper and got to work. First amphora, clean. Second, slight lead trace. Third, nothing. Fourth, she stopped. It looked different. The glaze under her candlelight shimmered slightly green, not the usual white or terracotta. She scraped a sample into a vial and sniffed the opening. Sharp. This wasn't just lead. It was verdigris copper acetate, formed when copper or bronze vessels corroded in vinegar or wine. In small doses, it tingled the tongue. In larger doses, it corroded the stomach lining, damaged kidneys, and muddled the mind. It was considered medicinal by some apothecaries, but only in dried, carefully measured forms. Liquid verdigris was volatile, dangerous, and it had no place in a royal drink. Murin stood, suddenly breathless. This changed everything. The amphora had likely been patched or sealed with a bronze fixture, something decorative, no doubt. A flourish, a royal flourish. It wasn't just bad storage. It was careless design, and worse, it wasn't just the prince. If others drank from this same batch, it meant the palace itself was eating its own through formality and aesthetic vanity. Historians still debate whether the use of verdigris in cooking was a mistake or deliberate. The Byzantines used it to colour sweets. The French later banned it. But in this moment, Miriam didn't care about history. She cared about saving a boy who never asked to be poisoned by his own goblet. She left the cellar with the sample tucked in her cloak and her heart pounding in her throat. Back in the herbarium, she worked late into the night refining the prince's new treatment, adding dried agrimony and a small risky dose of antimony powder suspended in milk thistle extract. A purifier, if handled precisely. The prince didn't stir that night, but his skin colour began to warm and his pulse found a steadier rhythm. Still, court politics waited for no one. The next morning, Egelric stood at the chapel steps, flanked by 2 clergy and reading a prepared statement to a small crowd of noble onlookers. And in light of unauthorized practices within the palace walls, I must formally request that all herbal treatments be reviewed and suspended pending divine consultation. Translation: get the star boiler out before she proves me obsolete. Miriam didn't set to react. She didn't set to have to, because before the echo of his words faded, Queen Isolde herself stepped out from the nave, silencing him with a single raised hand. "The prince lives," she said, "because of her, and unless you can wake another heir from the brink of death, I suggest you stop interfering." It wasn't a victory. It was a warning, because now Miriam was no longer working in secret. Now the court would watch her every move, and the stars, they were boiling brighter than ever. The Queen's public defense of Miriam did not land softly. It rang through the palace like a cracked bell, disturbing, sharp, and impossible to ignore. Within hours, the court divided itself with the subtlety of a knife fight wrapped in brocade. On one side, the old guard, physicians, clerics, and courtiers loyal to tradition, eager to contain what they saw as a dangerous woman with too many ideas and not enough Latin prayers. On the other, the curious, the uncertain, the quietly impressed, people who had seen the prince stir under Merowyn's care and could no longer pretend her potions were simply folk tales with a fancy garnish. And in the middle, Miriam herself, trying to treat a royal body in a den of snakes. She took no pleasure in the Queen's support. It was useful, yes, but unstable. Nobles rarely trusted what they could not name, and Miriam had no name that suited them. Healer was too plain, witch too dangerous. Alchemist was fashionable, but only for foreign men with big beards and scrolls from Salerno. Still, she kept working. By now, Prince Aldrich was speaking in fragments. Small words, names. He called for his falcon once, and for someone named Tomlin, though no one knew who that was. He struggled with fever at night, and suffered shaking fits in the morning, but the blue stain on his gums had faded. His pupils responded to light. Progress. Miriam stayed by his side through most of it, alternating between tending him and building a better map of his condition. She began tracking his responses to specific treatments, logging the hour, mixture, and any reaction. By the end of the week, she had drafted what amounted to the kingdom's first running clinical chart. A fact that meant nothing, of course, unless someone could read her shorthand. So she made a choice. She decoded a single page, just one. The section describing the charcoal tincture and its use in cases of metal toxicity. She copied it into courtly Latin, the kind that physicians could read without breaking into a rash, and left it, unsigned, in the prince's chamber where the Queen was sure to find it. The next morning she did. Historians still argue whether Queen Isolde recognized the page's origin or chose to pretend she didn't. Either way, the scroll was soon shared, quietly, with several skeptical nobles, including a certain reluctant cleric named Brother Timaeus, who Miriam had once caught snooping in the herbarium under the pretense of recording God's flora. With the scroll circulating, the tone shifted, not loudly, not overnight. But where once Merowyn had been an irritant, now she was a curiosity. The moment things truly changed, however, was not scientific. It was theatrical. The court had gathered in the outer garden for the Feast of St. Corwin, a minor holy day, but one taken seriously by the nobility, mostly because it involved sugared wine and the excuse to wear their finest embroidery. Merwyn had been invited. In theory, she did not attend. But as she passed the garden on her way to the apothecary wing, she heard something strange. Silence. Not reverent silence. Suspicious silence. She turned. In the middle of the garden, laid out for display, was a copper basin filled with scented wine, and beside it a silver goblet of the same sort that had held the prince's poison. She frowned, watched. Then she saw it, a group of ladies gathered around, including Lady Selwyn, whispering about whether the goblet had been enchanted. Some wanted to try the wine, others were afraid. And just like that, an idea took root. She approached the table, slowly. The group parted like reeds before her, unsure whether to curtsy or flee. Marin picked up the goblet and raised it high. "This," she said calmly, "was the vessel that nearly killed your prince. Not through sorcery or spellcraft, but through decoration. See how the metal has turned green at the lip? That sip's not divine punishment. That sip's verdigris. Copper corrosion. Beautiful, isn't it?" Silence. She took a second goblet, ceramic, plain, and poured the same wine into it. Then she uncorked a small vial from her belt, added 2 drops and waited. In the silver goblet, the wine turned cloudy. In the ceramic one, it remained clear. "Science," she said softly, "doesn't sit always wear robes. Sometimes it just pays attention." A single stunned clap came from the back. Thalion. The rest followed, awkward and slow. It wasn't a standing ovation, but it was, in its way, a coronation. Later that night, a servant slipped a folded note beneath her door. No wax, no name, just one sentence. "They believe you now. Be careful who they ask you to save next." She stared at it for a long time, because she already knew. When the prince was strong enough to walk again, someone would ask her for more. And the court, now that it had tasted her miracle, wouldn't stop at one. In fact, someone was already knocking at her chamber door. Literally. She opened it to find the steward of the High Almoner holding a sickly-looking monk by the arm. "This one fainted during prayers," the steward said. "He seps, seeing things. You sep been requested." Requested. Not ordered. That was new. She pulled the monk inside, checked his pulse, his breath, his eyes, and what she saw made her stomach twist. Pale gums, shaking hands, confused mutterings. Not a monk at all. Another victim. Another noble in borrowed robes. And now the court was coming to her, one by one, not to accuse, but to be cured. They started trickling in the next day, quietly, carefully, like mice avoiding a cat they hoped was in a forgiving mood. Not all came in robes. Some wore veils, some masks. A few didn't come at all, but sent tokens, kerchiefs with bloodstains, scribbled notes describing tremors, strange dreams, tingling feet. Merwyn didn't need their names. She recognized the symptoms. They were variations of the same poison, lid, verdigris, copper salts, different wines, different glazes, the same silent culprit. She worked in secret now, more than ever, not because she was hiding, but because discretion had become the price of continued access. Royals, she found, had no problem being saved, as long as it didn't look too obvious. Still, not all observers were discreet. The palace had begun to watch her in earnest. Not openly, not rudely, but like one might study a lit candle left too close to velvet. Servants passed her twice on their routes. Letters she hadn't sent arrived mysteriously unsealed. Even her chamber door squeaked a little louder now, as if someone had carefully loosened the hinge to better mark her comings and goings. Which made her next project particularly risky. She wanted to test the palace food supply. Not just the wine, but the dried fruits, the vinegar, the salts, the imported honey sealed in ornate bronze jars. To do this, she needed help. Fortunately, she had a boy with sharp ears and faster fingers. Rye, the stable-hand son who'd warned her before, appeared just after moonrise one night with a burlap sack and a grin. 2 jars of honey, 3 vinegar flasks, and whatever this is, he said, pulling out a small tin labelled in Greek. Also, the cook thinks a ghost is stealing the gooseberries. Mirren smiled for the first time that day. She set to work immediately. The tests were crude but effective. Vinegar drawn across lead sheets. Honey dropped onto dried parsley to test for sour reaction. The tin, still sealed, contained preserved quince. It was packed in an oily brine that, when stirred, gave off a smell she recognized too well. Turpentine, she muttered. Not deadly in trace amounts, but corrosive, especially if consumed regularly. Mirren stared at the jar, heart sinking. How much of the palace's supposed luxury had become its curse? How many more mystery ailments were just noble appetites outrunning their common sense? She logged it all in her notebook, systematically, objectively. She had proof now of a failing system, of dangerous luxury, of the invisible rot gilded in gold. And yet, the court didn't see it that way. Proof, as it turned out, only mattered if it aligned with the desired narrative. Already, there were whispers. She found illness everywhere, perhaps because she spreading it. None of these symptoms existed before she arrived. I saw her spoon glow in the moonlight. Mirren sighed. She didn't mind being feared. She did mind being blamed. She doubled her efforts. Administered treatments under cover of dusk. Created false labels for her tinctures to confuse any prying eyes. 1 bottle of distilled wormwood was marked button polish. A powerful anti-inflammatory was labelled Goose Tamer. She even wore a different coloured cloak depending on what she carried, so the guards would think she was part of the cleaning staff. A practical fringe fact here: during the medieval period, many female herbalists used secret codes or symbols on their mixtures to protect recipes. Some carved runes into the wood of their apothecary drawers, others tucked notes behind false panels. Mirren wasn't so old-fashioned, she just hid everything in plain sight. But suspicion was rising. It came to a head when a young kitchen girl collapsed in the great hall. Mirren rushed forward instinctively, pressing 2 fingers to the girl's neck, feeling the weak pulse fluttering like moth wings. The onlookers drew back. She was in the middle of preparing a ground valerian compress when she noticed something odd, a ring of pale bruising around the girl's throat, like a necklace made of ghosts. This wasn't poison, it was strangulation, but softly done, likely with fabric, likely meant to look like collapse. She froze. This wasn't illness. It was a message. And then she heard the voice, soft, behind her. "She was seen speaking to you yesterday," said Lady Meristone. Her tone wasn't loud, but it cut through the whispering crowd like glass through silk. "Curious, no?" Marie met her gaze calmly. "I speak to many. None have collapsed from it. Yet." Lady Meristone turned and swept away. The Queen said nothing. That night, Mirren lay awake in her chamber, listening to the scrape of footsteps beyond her door. Not guards, not servants. Observers. That's the trouble with being too effective. Once you cure a prince, people stop asking if you're powerful. They start wondering how dangerous you might be if you ever turned. She reached beneath her bed and retrieved the coded notebook, flipping through the pages until she found a single phrase she written weeks ago in the margins. "Who watches the healer?" She looked at it for a long time, then added a new note. "Everyone." Eventually, the next morning, Thalion arrived with a look she didn't like. "The High Almoner has requested your treatment notes," he said, voice low, "for oversight." "Curious," she replied. "He's never shown interest in science before. They want to copy your methods." Holian admitted. "Sanitize them. Repackage them under a cleric SIPS seal." Mirren closed her notebook. "They can try," she said. He hesitated. "You give it to them?" "If I do," she said quietly, "I disappear. Maybe not right away, but eventually, once they taken what they want." He nodded, solemn. "I or delay them." "How?" "By claiming you are too ill to meet." She raised an eyebrow. "It's half true," he added. "You look like you haven't slept in a week." She hadn't. That afternoon she mixed a salve for herself, rosemary, beeswax, comfrey, smoothed it across her temples, sat by the prince's bed, watching the pulse beneath his skin. She sipped saved him, but the sickness in the palace? That was just beginning to spread. It was raining by the time Miran reached the river. Thin, silvery threads fell from a bruised sky, soaking through her cloak and clinging to the little vials bundled at her belt. The prince had been stable for 3 days now, eating, speaking in quiet sentences, and blinking like someone just waking from a long, unpleasant dream. But Miran hadn't set come out here for the prince. She sept come for the barley. It was Thalion who'd arranged it. Quietly, of course. The prince's barley wine, he'd discovered, came not from the palace gardens, but from an old supplier downstream, a respected farming estate, nestled along a gentle bend in the royal river. Marian had asked to see the fields. No one had objected. After all, she was just the star boiler. What could a hedge witch possibly find in the soil? The barley fields swayed in the wind like golden furrows combed by invisible hands. At first glance, they looked perfect, healthy, ordered, but Merowyn knew better than to trust appearances. She knelt beside a patch near the waterline and sifted through the soil. Too dark, too wet, rich with sediment. She pinched some between her fingers and sniffed it. Then, with her other hand, lifted a chunk of river clay from beneath the stalks and scraped it with a small iron blade. Green streaks. Copper. So it wasn't just the amphorae in the cellar. The barley itself had been grown in water contaminated by runoff, perhaps from aging bronze statues upstream or discarded alchemical waste. Medieval cities weren't known for tidy waste disposal, and many workshops simply emptied refuse into the nearest convenient stream. Historians still argue whether early farmers understood the long-term effects of metal-tainted soil, she muttered to herself. But if they did, they sure didn't stop. She gathered a sample, sealed it in waxed linen, and rose to leave. At the edge of the field, she found a cart driver smoking a thin reed pipe. He looked at her with suspicion, then nodded toward the barley. "Good crop this year," he said. "Strong stalks." She held up the green-streaked clay. Strong, yes, but not safe. He frowned, blinking. "Do the nobles drink it too?" "Only the Prince Sep's wine," the man replied. "The rest of the estate sells to the convents and merchants." She raised an eyebrow. So only the highest quality was tainted. He didn't reply. That evening she returned to the palace with the samples tucked tightly in her satchel. The guards at the gate barely looked at her anymore, just stepped aside with wary nods, as though moving too quickly might trigger a curse or a lesson in metallurgy. In her chamber she spread the samples across her work table, and began the delicate task of drying and separating the soil's elements. The barley she roasted lightly and ground into a paste with vinegar. When tested against a thin strip of silver leaf, it tarnished black. Definitive. The poison had not come from a single mistake. It was layered. Amphorae, soil, storage. Even the water used to boil the wine might have carried trace elements. And yet, what she couldn't explain still gnawed at her. The prince was recovering, yes, but he was also changing. His dreams had turned vivid. He spoke in his sleep, sentences in languages he shouldn't know. Once, Meryn caught him murmuring in Old Breton, a dialect spoken only in the far western isles. Another time, he recited what sounded like a recipe for bronze dye, in Greek. She noted everything. She tested for fever, for lingering neurological effects. She even checked his pupils for unusual dilation. There was something there, something still unfolding. But she couldn't say what. And then came the knock at her door. This time, it wasn't a steward, or a frightened noble, or Thalion, with his half-grin and cautious loyalty. It was the Queen, unannounced, unescorted. Merwyn bowed, but barely. "Your Majesty." Queen Isolde stepped into the room like she owned the very shadows. Her eyes scanned the samples, the vials, the scrolls, and finally rested on the notebook with its code of crescents, arrows, and crooked lines. "You found something," the Queen said. "Yes," Meereen replied. "Too much, and not enough." She held up the barley soil. "This was fed to your son, grown in poisoned water, sealed in leaded jars, poured into silver cups. Every piece looks noble, but the hole is rot. The queen didn't flinch. And how do we stop it? First, remove the statues along the upper river. Their bases leak copper runoff. Then, replace the wine jars. Inspect the soil. Ban verdigris glazes. But that sip's just the beginning. The queen tilted her head. There stips more? Yes. Mirowin Sip's voice softened. Your son has knowledge in him that shouldn't it be there. Words in dead tongues. Recipes from forgotten lands. Isolde Sep's lips pressed thin. Witchcraft? She asked quietly. No, Mirren said. Memory, like his body, is holding on to things it shouldn't know. It might be a side effect, or something deeper. The queen turned toward the door, then paused. If I allow you to keep working, if I protect you, what will you give me in return? Mirwen stared at her. Not potions, not illusions. Truth, even when it sips inconvenient. Isolde Sip's mouth curled, just slightly. That Sip's the most dangerous offering of all. She turned to leave. Be careful, Starboiler. Set beginning to attract more than just curiosity. And with that, she was gone. Mirwin stood in the silence, heart pounding. She looked down at her notes, at the copper-streaked clay, at the prince's scribbled phrases in Greek and Breton. Something was still boiling, and this time it might not be poison. It might be him. The palace liked performances, and Mirwin, despite herself, knew how to deliver one. When word spread that the prince was sitting up in bed, the court demanded to see it for themselves. They didn't trust physicians anymore, certainly not ones who had argued for leeches and failed to prevent their heir from slipping into a death-like haze. No, they wanted spectacle now, reassurance, something worthy of being whispered about in velvet-draped corridors. So Mirwin gave it to them. The boiling of stars was, of course, never part of the actual treatment, but perception mattered, especially in a world where noble minds equated science with sorcery if it didn't arrive wrapped in Latin. She arranged the chamber carefully. At the centre, the prince reclined on cushions, propped up with pale silk, dressed not in regal finery, but a simple linen robe. His skin had regained its tone, his eyes their focus. He looked, for the first time in weeks, human. At his side stood a low brazier. Inside, a glass cauldron, rare, borrowed from the castle's forgotten alchemy wing, bubbled with a carefully designed infusion, water, honey, crushed fever, few, and a shaving of powdered antimony suspended in wormwood. Mirren had added one secret ingredient, a touch of eel oil, extracted months ago in the fen, which shimmered faintly when heated. The result? A gently glowing brew that hissed and sparkled, just enough to draw attention without alarming the clergy. And the audience arrived. Nobles, ministers, a bishop or two, the queen, even Egelric, arms crossed, face like curdled milk. Mirwin began her work without a word. She moved like a conductor, measuring, stirring, decanting the brew into a shallow glass chalice and lifting it to the prince's lips. He drank. Not all of it, just enough for effect. Then he looked up. Thank you, he said. His voice still rasped, but it carried. The effect on the room was electric. Lady Selwyn gasped audibly. The Queen Sept's eyes shone. Someone in the back whispered, Saints preserve us. Merwin stepped aside, allowing the silence to stretch. Then she turned toward the assembly and spoke in measured tones. This is not witchcraft, she said. This is observation, understanding, willingness to see what sips there, rather than what tradition says must be. She gestured toward the prince. He drank from tainted vessels, wine stored in glazed pots, containing metals that have no place in a living body. I used charcoal, antimony, and knowledge gathered from the east and the north, from scrolls and fields. Not spells, science. A murmur rolled through the crowd. Historians still argue whether early court healers truly knew the effects of metals on the body, she continued. But I seen it. I measured it, and I treated it. If you wish to avoid more deaths, we must change how we store, brew, and build. It was bold, perhaps too bold, but it was also carefully staged. The glowing liquid, the seated prince, the silence afterward. Even Egelric could not argue with the result. He did try. Antimony, he muttered loudly, has been used to purge the humours, but in controlled environments, under monastic supervision. Then perhaps, Miriam said, the monks should come learn from me. A ripple of quiet laughter broke out, not mocking, approving. Queen Isolde stepped forward. The court thanks you, Mistress Miriam, she said, and would ask that you continue your work with full access to the infirmary and the royal archives. That last part was unexpected. The archives were sacred, guarded, reserved for scholars with papal permission. Merowen bowed slightly. I will treat who I can, but I will also teach. I will document everything, openly. If we hide the truth, we invite repetition. That evening, alone in the herbarium, she sat by the still-glowing cauldron and let her breath slow. Her hands trembled, not from fear or cold, from sheer exhaustion. It had worked, but it had also invited attention. Later that night, Thalion appeared, leaning in the doorway with a grin. Yusuf made quite a few enemies today. She didn't look up. I thought I already had. Now they sifted just public about it. He stepped inside, tossed a folded scrap of parchment onto her desk. Someone left that on my writing desk. No seal, no name. She unfolded it. It was written in the same hurried, slanted hand as the lavender note weeks ago. They don't want the prince to recover. He saw something he wasn't meant to remember. She froze. Do you believe it? She asked. Thalion hesitated. I believe he talks in his sleep, and that sometimes he says things that make the servants whisper. Like what? Like the name of the Queen Sipta's father, and the colour of a robe she burned before her wedding. Things no child should remember. A chill crept up her spine. What if, she whispered, the wine didn't just poison him? What if it unlocked something? Thalion paled. That sip's not medicine, he said. No, she agreed. It saps memory, and memory is dangerous in the wrong mouth. Outside, bells rang for Compline. The court, for now, had embraced her. But the closer she came to truth, the more she realized. Some in this palace were more frightened of clarity than illness. The prince was better. But now, someone would want him quiet again. And if they couldn't unmake the cure, they might come for the one who administered it. Merwin reached for her notes and began rewriting everything, duplicating the formulas, hiding the originals, preparing. Because in this court, stars weren't the only thing boiling. Secrets were too. The prince spoke full sentences by the next morning, quiet, yes, measured, but unmistakably lucid. He sat upright, legs wrapped in wool, and a tray of poached pears untouched at his side. Mirren entered to find him gazing out the tall window, as if the view had been patiently waiting for him this whole time. She approached slowly, clipboard in hand. Good morning, Highness. He didn't turn. It starts raining. It usually is, she replied, checking the lines of ink across his chart. This country drinks clouds for breakfast. I dreamt of fire, he said, but not red, blue, like melted glass. She froze for the briefest moment. Was that recent? No, he murmured. Years ago, only just remembered. He finally turned to look at her. His eyes, still rimmed with the shadows of convalescence, held a clarity that hadn't been there before. I know your name, he said. Merween, they called you the woman who boils stars. And what do you call me? He considered, necessary. She almost smiled. Almost. But something in his tone gave her pause. There was a stillness to him, not the tired heaviness of recovery, but the kind that came before storms. Later that day she returned with a new tincture, a fortifying blend of thistle milk, fig bark, and a pinch of crushed pearl. Nothing showy, just strength in a cup. He drank it without question. What do you remember, she asked softly, from when you were ill? He was silent for a long time. Then voices, not mine, not in my head, somewhere else, like they were on the other side of the walls. She waited. And I remember a man, he continued, wearing black, with rings on every finger. He sat at the foot of my bed and said, Sleep, boy, there sips nothing left worth waking for. Sips. That wasn't sit to dream. He looked at her. No? No, You mumbled it aloud. On the third day after your fever broke, I was there. He looked out the window again, jaw clenched. You saved me. Technically, I saved your liver. And now everyone bows lower than they used to. They think I step am a miracle, but they don't step to ask what I remember. She stepped closer. Do you want them to? No. Another pause. I remember everything, Marouin, he said. Not just voices, letters, conversations, secrets I overheard as a child, faces I saw once in a corridor. I can recite a recipe for gunpowder in Arabic, though I don't remember reading it. She sat down, slowly. That sip's not from me. I know. I didn't give you knowledge. I gave you time. Your brain did the rest. He studied her, so I was always like this. No, she said gently, but perhaps you were always capable, and now the walls that held your memory have crumbled. He looked down at his hands. I think someone knew, he whispered, and wanted me kept asleep. Now here's your fringe fact for the evening. Some medieval thinkers believed that the mind, when fevered or near death, could become a vessel for divine clarity, like cracking a shell to let out the soul. Others believed the opposite, that illness opened the door for demons to walk in. The truth, as usual, sits somewhere between the two, because the prince had awakened not just cured, but changed. That evening, as Mirin prepared her night batch of valerian root and dried lemon balm, she heard whispers outside her chamber. Servants again. But this time, the tone was different. She's sick's got him under a spell. He stares too long now, doesn't sit blink enough. My cousin says he quoted something from the first King Sep's private journals. Those are locked in the crypt. The superstition was back, but this time, it wasn't about Marin. It was about what she done. No one likes a miracle that comes with questions, especially ones that look you in the eye and remember your sins. The prince's change was unsettling the palace in subtle, spreading ways. Lady Selwyn had taken to crossing herself every time he entered a room. The steward who once boasted about his lineage now stuttered in the prince's presence. Even Egelric had stopped lobbying for Marin's removal, though whether that was due to professional shame or tactical fear, she couldn't say. Then came the Queen Sip's summons, again, this time to her private writing chamber, smaller than the throne room, warmer, lined with tapestries and the scent of ink. Mirwin, she said without preamble, what sip's wrong with my son? Nothing, Mirwin answered carefully. That sip's the problem. The Queen Sip's fingers flexed around a quill. He speaks like someone twice his age, mentions things no one Sit's taught him. He even quoted one of my father Sit's letters, one that was burned. He heard it, Mirwin said. Somewhere, somehow, the mind stores more than we know. Maybe the fever loosened something. Maybe the poison burned away the clutter. But your son isn't bewitched. He Sip's awakened. To what? Mirwin didn't answer, because she wasn't sure. That night, the prince visited her chambers. No guards, no herald, just a quiet knock. I need to show you something, he said. She followed him through the east wing, down a winding stair lit only by wall sconces and the occasional rat. At the bottom was a locked door, iron, marked with an alchemical symbol she hadn't seen in years. Prima materia, the base material of all things. He produced a key. Inside was a chamber sealed to most. Dusty, silent, lined with scrolls, dried herbs, and cracked crucibles. The old alchemist Sip's lab, he said. Forgotten. And then he whispered, I think I seen this place before, but he hadn't not in this life. Miron stepped inside slowly, heart thudding, because something about the room hummed, not with magic, with recognition. Whatever the prince had remembered, it had begun here, and she, it seemed, was now part of it. The door closed behind them with a sound like history sighing through rusted hinges. The air in the alchemist's chamber was dry and stubborn, like it had decided not to circulate for at least a generation. Dust clung to everything, the shelves lined with sealed clay jars, the long-forgotten crucibles resting on iron tripods, and a massive tome open on a stone lectern, its parchment pages curled at the edges like dried petals. Mirren stepped carefully, not from reverence, but precision. She could feel the story layered into the stone. The floor had been swept with purpose once. The bench was grooved with decades of mixing and measuring. The very walls seemed to breathe ingredients. "This belonged to Archmaster Alwyn," the prince said quietly. "My grandfather Sleepy Alchemist. They say he vanished, left behind only riddles and a poorly fed cat." Mirin arched an eyebrow. "And why are you down here?" "I remembered it," he replied. "In a dream, exactly as it is. That book," he pointed, "was open to that page." She approached the lectern. The parchment was filled with geometric diagrams and annotations in a mix of Latin, Arabic, and something she couldn't place immediately. There were spiral notations beside elemental symbols: iron, lead, mercury. Familiar alchemical shorthand, yes, but beneath it, scratched faintly in red ink, was a phrase repeated several times. "Corpus lucet in tenebris." The body shines in darkness. Fringe fact for tonight. Some fringe medieval alchemists believed that illness could be burned clean by unlocking the body's inner light, lux corporis. They believed the soul's memory lingered in every cell, and that with the right conditions, knowledge could be drawn up like water from a deep well. "This is," Mirin traced the page, "old, possibly older than your grandfather." The prince nodded. "There's more." He crossed the room to a cabinet, pulled open a hidden drawer beneath a false panel, and withdrew a rolled parchment, bound in waxed silk. He handed it to her. It was a map. No, a chart. A web of anatomical diagrams overlaid with astrological glyphs, plant names in Greek, and what looked like dosing instructions etched beside specific dates. Moon phases, solstices, solubility markers. "This isn't set spellcraft," she said, awed despite herself. "This is a compound calendar. For medicine, precise medicine." "Was this how you treated me?" he asked. "No," she admitted, "but it seps how I might sep. Had I known this existed." She turned to him, suddenly suspicious. "And how did you know?" He hesitated. "I don't know. I just did." Merowyn stared at him. The palace had always treated memory as dangerous, especially when it didn't belong to the right people. A servant who remembered too much gossip was reassigned. A scholar who questioned scripture was quietly defunded. But this was different. "You sit a not remembering," she said. "You sit a inheriting." He nodded. "I think so too." Outside the chamber, the palace continued its quiet gossip. The healer had cured the prince. Yes, but the prince wasn't the same, and it was only a matter of time before someone tried to explain it in ways that didn't end with science. Which is precisely when the summons came. Not from the queen this time, from the High Almoner. His steward appeared at dusk, wearing a robe too stiff with starch and a frown that never quite faded. He bowed stiffly. "The Almoner requests your records." "All of them." Merwyn stared at the man. "For what purpose?" "To verify the purity of your practice. For the church SIP's oversight." "Church oversight." The phrase curled around her spine like ice. "If the purity of my practice were in question," she said slowly, "you sit be speaking to the queen, not me." The steward blinked. "This request comes with her blessing." That Merowyn doubted. Still, she handed over a single scroll, one of her decoys, a page filled with herbal summaries, carefully sanitized, devoid of ratios, tests, or anything remotely resembling the truth. The steward took it with barely a nod, but she wasn't set done. Later that evening, she dressed in her dark travelling cloak and slipped out the side passage near the apothecary, using the same route she'd used the first night she arrived. She found Thalion waiting under the archway, lantern in hand. "They said they're going to twist it," she told him. "Sanitize it. Publish some half-useful copy with the Almoner SIP's seal and call it Divine Inspiration." "They already have a scribe working on it," he replied. "They think if they claim the science, they can control the story." Mirin exhaled through her nose. "You still stop them. I still delay them, but you still need real proof to counter it." "I have it." She held up the chart from the alchemist SIP's lab. "This predates their entire system. It's SIP's not witchcraft. It's SIP's record-keeping, older and sharper than anything in their libraries." "You start going to show the court?" "No," she said. I said I'm going to teach the prince. Thalion blinked. You said you're going to train him. If they once sit, let me write freely. I sit'll write through him, teach him to speak the words they fear in ways they can sit deny. He sit'll become my record. And if they come for you, Mirwin looked toward the tower. Then he sit'll be ready to defend himself with truth, not superstition. And truth, in a place built on inherited myths and fragile pageantry, was the most volatile substance of all. The air in the royal library always smelled of old parchment and pride. Rows upon rows of illuminated manuscripts slept beneath thick glass or behind iron-banded cabinets, each one catalogued with reverent labelling, De Natura Corporis, Ecclesiasticum Hortum, Treatise of Bones, King Berengar's edition. Nothing here was unvetted, nothing dangerous, at least, not officially. But Mirwen had learned long ago that danger doesn't always announce itself with flames. Sometimes it wears silk bindings and waits quietly to be read. She was there, deep in the archive vaults, under the careful supervision of a sleepy-eyed assistant scribe named Wendell. Queen Isolde had granted her special access quietly, of course, with the strict condition that nothing be removed or copied without permission. So Mirwen didn't sit to copy, she memorized. She pored over the oldest texts, forgotten codices from the early reigns, dusty and unadorned, kept only because no one dared discard a book written in the king's father's hand. She looked for records of illnesses, treatments, ingredients, but what she found was something different, something older. A note tucked between 2 pages of a crumbling royal diary. Not a note, really, a letter. It was written in a feminine hand, smooth, careful, and signed only with a looped M. The contents chilled her. They think I've cured the queen, but she grows weaker by the day. The cause is not the flesh, it is the barley. The barley, soaked in water drawn from the eastern aquifer. The prince's lips are already pale. If he lives to marry, I will be surprised. The date, 42 years earlier. The queen referenced, Isolde Sip's mother-in-law. The dying prince, Aldrich's uncle, the one who had died in his sleep at age 15. Mirwen sat back slowly, the candlelight trembling in the draughtless air. They had known. They sipped known for decades. The barley fields, the poisoned wine, the strange decline of royal health, the exact same symptoms retold as fairy tales, rewritten as quiet tragedies. The causes were never investigated, because it was easier, safer to bury inconvenient truths with pageantry and prayers. And now, they were doing it again. She slipped the letter into her sleeve, not to steal it, but to preserve it. If they buried this too, no cure she made would survive their silence. Here's a historical fact for tonight. Monarchies throughout Europe routinely censored medical failures. A royal death from illness could imply weakness, divine disfavor, or worse, corruption, so they altered records, destroyed journals, promoted apothecaries who were loyal over those who were skilled. But sometimes the truth remained, hidden in margins, scribbled in prayer books, tucked between recipes and botanical drawings. She returned the diary to its shelf, straightened her cloak, and exited the vault. That evening, she found the prince on the eastern balcony, barefoot, reading aloud from a scroll she didn't recognize. "The veins do not lie to the tongue," he recited. "If you taste metal, your liver knows more than your physician." She stopped beside him. "Where did you find that?" He turned, unbothered. "In the chapel library." In the chapel library. Someone had left it inside a hymnal. "Of course they did," she muttered. He grinned. "I thought you might like it." "I do. I just don't sit like who else might be reading it." "Let them," he said. "They already think we sit dangerous." That night, they worked together in the old alchemist's chamber. Mirwen laid out ingredients, and the prince, not just student but partner, recorded everything in clean, slanted script. He had steady hands now, a clear voice. Together, they drafted a new kind of record, not just dosages and herbs but context, symptoms, conditions, risk markers. Merin called it The Ledger of Refined Substances, a plain title, intentionally dull, to avoid drawing the eye. But it was revolutionary. It stated plainly what most healers only whispered. barley grown in metal-rich soil could harm. Lead-glazed amphorae were silent killers. Certain plants, once feared, could purify when used precisely. Memory loss might be chemical, not spiritual. It was the kind of writing that would get her burned if the wrong person read it. And yet, she kept going. Until one night, something changed. She returned to her chamber to find the lock broken, the door ajar. Inside, chaos. Her vials shattered, her herbs scattered, her notes, the ones in code, gone. She didn't stick, scream. She didn't stick, move. She simply stepped over the broken glass, picked up the only thing left undisturbed, a small clay figurine she'd brought from Elthing Fen, shaped like a hare with a crown, and set it gently on her windowsill. Then she turned, calmly, and left. Not to weep, not to warn, but to retrieve what she still had. The prince, the chart from the alchemist's sit slab, and now the royal letter. They sit tried to silence her work, to erase her, but they sit forgotten something. You can steal a healer's notes, you can break her tools, but you can sit unlearn what she sits taught. And she had taught the prince everything. It was just after midnight when Mirren reached the outer gates, dressed as a lay sister from the Queen's cloister, grey robes, simple shoes, and a veil that smelled faintly of lavender and damp wool. She'd borrowed it, of course, with silent permission. She carried no satchel, no scrolls, only the figurine from her windowsill, nestled in her sleeve like a guardian. The guards waved her through without question. Nuns came and went often, tending to the sick, delivering prayers, ferrying linens and secrets. Marian slipped through the palace's outer walls like a ghost in plain sight, following the narrow east road toward the ruined convent of St. Roswin. The place hadn't housed nuns in decades. Officially, it had been abandoned after a fire destroyed part of the eastern wing. Unofficially, it was still visited by servants seeking quiet, by lovers seeking darker corners, and more rarely, by the desperate in need of remedies too delicate for palace hands. She wasn't sector going there for prayer. She was going for a cure. The convent had once maintained a medicinal garden, one of the finest in the kingdom. The record said it held over 100 species of plants, including rarities from as far as Tunis and Constantinople. Some claimed the last abbess had written a compendium so advanced the church quietly buried it along with her. Merwin intended to find it. By the time she reached the outer gate, the rain had turned to mist, and her boots were soaked through. She pulled the hood tighter and ducked through the broken archway. Ivy curled through the cracked stone like veins. The chapel itself leaned westward slightly, the bell tower cracked and sagging like a mourner's shoulder. But the apothecary wing, small, square, and sunk half into the earth, was intact. She lit a stub of beeswax and entered. The air was thick with mildew and old time. Wooden drawers lined the walls, each one labelled in faded ink, Papava, Verbena, Terebinthus. Most were empty or gnawed through by time, but the walls, Mirabin noticed, were lined with symbols, simple ones, crosses, moons, the same crescent marks she'd used in her own journals. She paused, ran her fingers along one carved into the stone beneath the window. Then she reached into the fireplace and pressed her hand against the back wall. It gave way. A hollow space. Inside, a waxed bundle, tightly bound and still dry. She pulled it free and sat on the floor, breaking the seal. Inside were 3 thin volumes, bound in treated calfskin and inked in a woman's sip's hand. No name, no crest, just titles. Formulas of the body, symptoms of the noble and common, the cloistered cure. It was real. She opened the last one, hands trembling. Pages of notes, ratios, descriptions, case studies. Even her breath caught names. One she recognized. Queen Adelan, in the 7th year of reign. The treatments matched the symptoms of Aldrich's illness: fainting, breathlessness, pale gums, and the cure: a tincture of sheep's milk steeped with ash moss and warmed with elderflower syrup, administered over 8 days. Simple, elegant, entirely herbal. Buried, because it had worked. And no one wanted a woman-sit cure on record. Here's your historical tidbit. Female monastics in the 12th century were often the true physicians of their communities. Cloistered life didn't just involve prayer, it included healing, study, and occasionally sophisticated medical practice. Many of their works were later co-opted or erased under male authorship. Marin ran her finger down the final page and found a scrawl in the margin. If they do not believe you, save them anyway. That is the burden. She read it again. Then she tucked the books beneath her cloak and slipped back into the mist. By the time she returned to the palace, dawn had broken. Bells rang softly in the distance. No one stopped her. They wouldn't, not until it was too late. In her chambers, she dried the pages gently over a brazier, then copied them, once into code and once into plain script. She delivered the plain version to the prince that evening. He read silently, then looked up. This is her handwriting. You remember it? I don't know how I do, but yes. He looked back at the page. She saved my grandmother, he said, and they buried her work. They buried all of it, Mirren said, but now it sets back. Thalion entered then, breathless. They Sips announced a public hearing tomorrow. The High Almoner wants your findings tested before a council of nobles. Tested how? They still bring in another patient, one of their choosing. You will be asked to cure them. Mirren stared. That Sips not medicine, that Sips theatre. It sits also a trap, Thalion said, but the Queen can sict block it, not openly. She turned to the prince. Will you stand with me? I still do better, he said. I still speak. Mirowin closed the book and looked out her window. The stars were hidden behind clouds, but she could feel them boiling just the same. The court gathered under an overcast sky, its curiosity wrapped in silk and suspicion. The hearing was held in the summer hall, a misnamed, draughty rotunda that smelled faintly of incense and wet limestone. Candles flickered along the arc of marble columns, throwing long shadows that danced on polished floors as if in anticipation. Merowyn stood alone before the crowd, her hands clasped loosely behind her back, the folds of her dark blue cloak hiding ink-stained fingers. She had dressed deliberately plain, no brooches, no pouches, no rings or tools to be labelled charms or wards, just herself and the truth. At the far end of the hall sat the High Almoner, ringed by minor lords, bishops, and a few especially bold noblewomen with fans held like shields. The Queen was present, but elevated, literally and politically, on a raised dais with a veil half drawn over her face. The prince was nowhere to be seen. Thalion stood discreetly near the door, eyes scanning for treachery. The Almoner spoke first, his voice rich and booming. You are summoned here, Mirromen of Elthing Fen, to demonstrate the nature of your work before the court, not as sorcery, not as gossip, but as practice. Your methods, if they are to be accepted, must stand before the gaze of reason and faith alike. She nodded once, without bowing. And your test, the Almoner continued, is this man. 2 guards led in a man of middle age, hollow-eyed and pale, clutching his abdomen. His gait was stiff, almost mechanical. His skin had the faint, sickly shine Mirren had seen before. Lead. Again, but something more. Mirren stepped closer and inhaled gently. Sweet, sharp breath. Not wine, not barley, something bitter. She turned to the Almoner. What has he consumed? A monk Thip's diet, he said flatly. Porridge, broth, wine only on feast days, and he is sworn to no sin. A quiet chuckle rippled through the room. Mirowyn didn't react. She knelt before the man and gently lifted his arm, studying the veins. Blue, thready, a bruise at the crook of the elbow. You've been bleeding him, she said. For balance, said one of the bishops. He has no balance left, she murmured. She rose and faced the audience. His sip's been poisoned slowly, likely through his ceramic drinking cup. The glaze has turned sour from repeated vinegar rinses. How can you know that? Demanded the Almoner. Because his sept's fading the same way the prince did. Because I know what it smells like. Because I sept's seen it. She turned to the patient. Do you trust me? The man blinked at her, barely lucid, but nodded. She reached into a satchel brought in by Thalion a satchel pre-approved by the court, its contents examined and listed. Inside, a vial of charcoal infusion, a thin strip of willow bark, and a spoon carved from bone. She administered the tincture carefully, drop by drop, then wrapped the willow bark in linen and instructed him to chew gently. "This is not magic," she said. "It sets chemistry. The charcoal binds to metal, the willow thins the blood without weakening it, and the body, if supported, can do the rest." The almoner raised a skeptical brow. "And how long before he rises and dances?" "This is not theatre," she snapped, before softening her tone. "But if he sits still and allowed warmth and rest, his sit'll be stronger by dusk." A tense silence followed, and then the door opened. The prince entered. Not in silk, not in armour, in plain wool, with a simple satchel slung over his shoulder. He walked to the centre of the room and stood beside Meeruen, and then he spoke. "This woman," he said clearly, "saved my life, not with spells, with observation, with calculation, with reason. You call this a test, but it was I who tested you. You let me sleep, unseeing, for weeks, and she, only she, woke me." Meeruen blinked, not at his words, at the tone. It was command, not request. The queen lowered her veil, just a fraction. The almoner stiffened. "She has notes, records, evidence," the prince continued, "and I have read them. I understand them. I have memorized them." Gasps, whispers. "And if any harm comes to her," he said, "I will ensure her knowledge does not die with her, because I am her student." There it was, the dangerous truth spoken aloud. Merwin Sit's teachings had taken root, not hidden in scrolls, not burned in cinders, but walking, breathing, ruling. Historians still argue whether this moment, this single declaration, marked the true beginning of Aldrich's future reign. Some say he was too bold. Others say he simply realized that truth was easier to control when spoken plainly. Either way, it worked. The almoner said nothing further. He simply nodded once, sourly, and declared the demonstration inconclusive. But the court had heard enough. After the hearing, nobles lined up, not to arrest Meeruen, but to request tinctures, advice, quiet help for quiet ailments. Thalian found her later in the herbarium, rinsing her tools. "You made him dangerous," he said. "No," she replied. "I just showed him what they were afraid of." "What Sep's that?" "A man who remembers." That night, she added a new entry to her hidden ledger, titled simply, "Day of Proof." Patient anonymous monk. The symptoms: lead poisoning, mild copper salts, humoral depletion. Treatment: activated charcoal herbal willow bark infusion. Outcome: colour returning, breathing stronger by sunset. Witnesses: court, prince, queen, enemies. She set the quill down, turned out the lantern, and whispered to the darkness, "They won Sit Berry this time, because the prince would remember, and he would not let the stars go cold." The next morning, the castle woke not to bells, but to rumours. The healer had stood before the court, the prince had defied the almoner, and somewhere in the fray, someone had quietly replaced the high almoner's ceremonial cup with a ceramic goblet that turned cloudy when filled with wine. He didn't stood drink it, but he noticed Merwin had expected retaliation, or at least resistance. But what came instead was stranger: silence. The kind of silence that pools before a political storm. She used it well. With quiet approval from the queen, she was granted access to the palace's lesser infirmary, a draughty but functional wing near the kitchens where lesser nobles, staff and servants received care. She took it over within hours, scrubbed every surface, burned old linens, ordered the ash-coloured stone walls scrubbed with lye and vinegar. She set up her own shelves, arranged tinctures, organised records. Within a day, the room no longer smelled of mildew. It smelled of crushed sage and slow-brewed honey balm. And people came, a scullery maid with inflamed joints, a guard with trembling fingers, a chamberlain's wife with stomach cramps that hadn't ceased in months. Each one came with a whisper, a glance, a hope. Each one walked out better than they arrived. And soon, her presence shifted. No longer a curiosity, a necessity. She began hosting brief consultations at dusk behind drawn curtains. She spoke plainly, explained her mixtures, taught apprentices the signs of poor storage, bad herbs, metal leaching. Some listened with reverence, others took notes like they were studying scripture, but not all welcomed her presence. The court had eyes, and not just the obvious ones. One night, Thalion met her in the corridor with a look she'd learnt to respect, tight-lipped, focused. "They sit were watching the Queen now," he said softly. "Not just you. They think she sits abandoned the old alliances." "She has," Miriam replied. "Not publicly. She doesn't set need to. Her silence is permission." Thalion sighed. "There are whispers the almoner is gathering support. He septs meeting privately. Their septs talk of religious review." Mirwin raised an eyebrow. "A trial?" "Not yet. But he sips calling it t'evaluation of devout methods. Teve you one net be named, but we sit all know who it sips about." She exhaled slowly. "He still wait until the prince leaves the infirmary. He once sit act while Aldrich can still speak." Thalion nodded. "Which is why the prince asked for you." Merwin blinked. "Now?" He nodded again. She found the prince standing at the northern gate of the garden, dressed in a heavy travelling cloak, his breath visible in the chill air. "You stir leaving," she said. "Only for a time," he replied. "The Queen thinks I should see the western abbeys. Let them look at me. Hear me speak. It saps a soft rebellion, one they can sept call heretical." She stared. "And if they ask what cured you?" "I sit'll tell them." He looked at her. "A sit'll tell them I was sick from their own vessels, that I was healed by someone who knew what poison smelled like, that their faith failed me, and your fire didn't set." "That sip's dangerous," she murmured. He grinned. "I stim royal. That sip's half the job." She studied his face. There was steel there now, not arrogance focus. The boy who had once whimpered through fever dreams was gone. This one remembered everything. "You said memorize the ledger." "Every page." "And the dosages?" "Charcoal to lead, 3-1. Wormwood for purging. Antimony in goat sips milk. Never with copper." She nodded. "You search were ready." "Not for this." He reached into his satchel and pulled out a bundle of folded parchment. Mirren unwrapped it slowly. It was her notes. Her original, uncoded notes. The ones stolen from her chambers. "They tried to burn them," he said. "The pageboy tasked with the job couldn't sit do it. He gave them to me." She looked up at him. "You saved my mind," he said. "Let me save your work." She blinked against the sudden warmth behind her eyes. Then something shifted in the wind. A bell rang, not for mass, for summons, an emergency. They both turned as a breathless page ran toward them. "Milady," he gasped. "You sipped wanted, urgently." "Where?" "The Queen sips solar." The Queen never summoned without sending her steward. Something was wrong. She ran. Through the halls, past startled courtiers, into the warm velvet of the solar where Queen Isolde stood pale-faced, hands balled around a crumpled parchment. "Someone tried to poison the High Almoner," she said without looking up. Merwin blinked. "I didn't sict." "I know you didn't it," Isolde snapped. "But they used your tincture vials, your labels, your handwriting." Silence bloomed in the room like smoke. "They want to destroy you," the Queen continued. "Not just question you, frame you." And there it was, the price of being seen. Mirwin straightened her shoulders. "I thit'll leave, disappear, save the palace the trouble." "No." The Queen stepped forward. "You sit'll stay, we fit'll fight. You sit'll be accused of harbouring a heretic." The Queen sipped. His eyes burned. "Then let them call me what they will." But Mirwin saw the hesitation beneath the fire. Isolde could protect her for now. But the kingdom had long arms and the church had deeper pockets than even the crown. She had one chance. Proof. A cure. Another one. Something only she could do. She turned on her heel and strode back toward the infirmary, thoughts churning. If she could treat the almoner, if he survived, she could expose the lie and reclaim her standing in one stroke. But as she reached the corridor, she found the infirmary empty. No guards, no candles, and in the middle of the floor, a single broken vial. Her own, with her name carved into the side. The stars weren't sicked boiling anymore. They were beginning to burn. The shards glittered faintly in the moonlight. Miriam crouched beside the broken vial, careful not to touch it. Whoever had left it here wanted it to be seen, not examined. A message. A threat disguised as evidence. She sniffed the air. Faint notes of rosemary and hyssop. A blend she hadn't made in weeks. One she used only for poultices, not ingestion. Whatever had been inside this vial, it wasn't poison, not originally. Which meant someone had altered it. She stood slowly, heart steady but cold, her mind already leaping 2 steps ahead. They'd moved fast, too fast. Miriam had barely finished earning the court's hesitant trust, and now the tides were being pulled back out to sea, replaced with whispers of murder. She wasn't surprised. That was the way of power. First they need you, then they fear you, then they find a reason to remove you. And the worst part? This time, the poison hadn't been metaphor. The High Almoner had collapsed during his supper. Witnesses described violent convulsions, darkening lips and vomiting, so severe 2 servants had fainted. He lived, but just barely, and according to the Queen Sep's steward, someone had placed a small slip of parchment at his bedside after, from the hand that boiled stars. Neat, elegant, utter fabrication. Miriam burned the note, not out of guilt, but out of calculation. Someone was using her legend against her. She had made herself indispensable. They'd made her intolerable. She returned to her chambers to find Thalion already there, pacing. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice low and tight. "He Set's poisoned," she replied, "but not by me." He nodded once. "Then we need to prove it. I need access to his blood. That one Sit be easy. They Sit put him under guard. To Sit put him under guard. Then distract them. Bring him this." She handed Thalion a simple cup of warm water steeped with crushed basil and silver leaf, both harmless, both prone to reacting with certain toxins. "If his lips turn grey after 2 sips, it's sips not my doing." Thalion hesitated. "And if they catch me, then I Sit'll boil stars again," she said flatly. But louder this time. He grinned despite himself. That night, Myrwin returned to the old alchemist's chamber, the one beneath the east wing, now her sanctuary. She spread out her notes, cross-referencing symptoms with her stolen copy of the cloistered cure. The almoner's reaction didn't match her known compounds. It was too fast, too violent, and then it hit her. She reached for a forgotten vial, cracked and stoppered with wax. Inside, traces of white powder, pulvis, argentiae, silver dust, used in tiny quantities to treat ulcers, deadly in the wrong hands. And not hers. No one outside the herbarium should have known where that vial was kept, unless they had been inside. Her mind raced. Rai, the stable boy turned shadow, had been missing for 2 days. No one had noticed. She closed her eyes, thought back to the whispers, the glances, the broken latch on her chamber door. Whoever had framed her, they'd been watching longer than she'd realized. She returned to the infirmary with Dawn at her heels. Inside, the prince was waiting. "I heard," he said simply. "I need your help." "I assumed," he replied. "You only come at sunrise when someone Sips tried to kill you or someone else." She gave him the satchel of evidence, the original note, the contaminated compound, and a list of every court official who'd had access to the herbarium. "Find the patterns," she told him. "Someone Sips moved against us. I want to know who." He nodded, already reading. "I Sit'll need time." "Time," she said, "is exactly what we set to losing." That evening, the Queen summoned her again, this time with none of the usual trappings. No veil, no scribes, no guards, just the monarch, sitting alone beside the hearth. "They want to exile you," she said, formally, quietly, its Seps being whispered as a mercy. Myrwin didn't Set flinch. "Then let them whisper. If you stay, they still push harder." "I Sept am not leaving," she said simply. "Not while the man who poisoned the almoner still walks your halls." The Queen studied her. "You know who it is?" "Not yet, but your son will. Soon. That gave the queen pause. She stirred the fire absently. You Sep changed him. He changed himself. I just opened the door. Another silence. Then softly, they sit'll come for him next. I know. The queen looked up. If you had to choose his safety or your truth. Merwin didn't hesitate. The truth is, his safety. They can unseat what Sip's been taught. The queen smiled faintly. Then I suggest we show them what that looks like. The next day, Merwin prepared a demonstration. Again. But this one was not for the court. It was for the kitchens, the servants, the soldiers, the scribes. In the great hall she lined up 2 wines, one safe, one poisoned. She explained the test, demonstrated the symptoms, let them see it for themselves. No spells, no fire, just fact. It spread faster than any rumor. By sunset, guards were refusing wine in metal cups. Maids scrubbed chalices with vinegar. Even a visiting bishop insisted on a wooden spoon. Science, at last, had become contagious. And the person who had framed her, they were running out of hiding places. That night, as Mirren sat writing her notes beside a gently boiling pot, Tholian returned with blood on his sleeve and something burning in his eyes. I know who did it, he said. She looked up. Tell me. And he did. The final piece, the missing hand behind the shadow. The man who had tried to kill the almoner. The man who had tried to kill the truth. The one who still wore the Queen Sep's colours. They found him not in shadow, but in silk. Lord Branrick, Master of Tithes, Keeper of the Royal Mint, and until this evening, the man responsible for allocating palace funds for arms, construction, and medical supplies. He was in the conservatory, tending to the orange trees imported from the southern coast, the scent of citrus clinging sweetly to the air. A man of quiet habits and fussy dignity, Branrick was not the sort most would suspect, and that, Mirwin realized, was precisely the point. Thalion stood behind her, flanking the entrance. The prince, hooded, waited in the corridor, close enough to intervene, far enough to observe. Lovely evening, Branrick said without turning. I suppose this is the part where you accuse me of something unpleasant. Merwin stepped forward, her boots crunching lightly on gravel. You tampered with my vial, slipped powdered silver into a compound, planted a note. He looked over his shoulder with the patience of a man enduring bad poetry. You make it sound so theatrical, he said. I merely nudged perception. You tried to kill the High Almoner. No, he said, brushing pollen from his sleeve. Just sicken him, long enough to discredit your work and restore the status quo. No one was meant to die. And if they had, he shrugged. Collateral failure, as in war. You know how that is. I know how death looks, she said. You don't sect. A pause, a quiet snip as he clipped a sprig from the orange tree. Why? She asked. Why poison? Why me? Branrick turned fully now. Calm, pale. Because you disrupted the system, he said. A system that kept noble families in power, clergy in favour, and people manageable. You gave them hope wrapped in science. You taught a prince to question things, to read outside scripture, to listen to women. It was dangerous. Mirren tilted her head. You were never afraid of me, were you? He smiled faintly. No, I was afraid of what you might teach. A rustle from the doorway as the prince stepped into view. Branrick saw him and faltered. You, he said softly. Me, Aldrich replied, voice quiet and sharp. I remember what you said the night before I fell ill. Branrick stiffened. You were delirious. You told me that purity came from obedience, that independent thought was a toxin. The nobleman Sip's face froze. You weren't Sip meant to remember that. No, said Aldrich, but I do. I remember everything. Branrick glanced toward the door. Calculating, but it was too late. Thalion stepped forward, arms folded. We already told the Queen. She believed you? No, said Merwin. She believed the prince. Branrick's shoulders sagged. Just a little. Just enough. You Stev won your war then, he said. Enjoy the ashes. No, said Mirren. We stir planting something new. He was taken quietly, not by guards, but by decree. The Queen stripped him of title. The council froze his holdings. The church, unwilling to defend a man who poisoned one of its own, let him fall without protest. By week's end, his name was erased from the ledgers he once managed. But Mehran's sits remained. The infirmary changed after that. No longer merely a place of healing, it became a place of learning. Mehran took on 2 apprentices, one from the kitchens, one from the archives, both young, both sharp, both eager to ask questions. Others had been punished for asking. The prince visited often, sometimes to study, sometimes just to sit in the corner and listen. He carried his own copy of the Ledger of Refined Substances, annotated in his own script. Together they began to sketch something new, a school, not just for nobles, for any who wished to learn, a place to study medicine free from superstition, hierarchy and fear, a place where boiling stars was just a poetic way of saying, pay attention. And here's your final historical morsel for tonight. Some scholars believe that the first documented medical schools in medieval Europe, like those in Salerno, were shaped not only by monks and scholars, but by anonymous women who passed knowledge in whispers, in kitchens, and behind convent walls. They were never credited, but they were never forgotten. 1 year later, the prince, now crowned, stood before the court once more. He wore a simple robe, no crown, and held a scroll in one hand. This, he said, is the official record of my recovery. It names not just the methods that saved me, but the woman who taught them. Let it be known, this court will not burn what it does not understand, it will learn. And across the room, Mehran stood, no longer just a village healer, but a name the court would remember, not for fire, not for magic, but for truth. Because sometimes stars don't sit, fall, they simmer, and a woman with a cauldron can light a kingdom. And so the stars quiet, not with a bang, not with a blaze, but with the soft exhale of a kingdom learning to listen again. The palace no longer whispers fearfully about Mehran. Now it whispers curiously, about dosage, about compounds, about whether beetle resin can really soothe a fevered tongue. The kitchens trade recipes that begin with "as the healer showed us," and the stable boy who once feared her potions now asks to carry them. The infirmary's windows are left open more often, to let in the smell of marjoram and sun-warmed stone. In the afternoons, children sneak peeks through the archways, trying to glimpse the woman who boiled stars and lived to tell the tale. And beneath it all, beneath the curing, beneath the caution, beneath the new pages being inked into royal ledgers, Mehran walks the hallways barefoot. Not out of rebellion, but because, after years of cold earth and colder glances, she no longer has to hide where her feet lead her. The prince continues to govern not just with laws but with questions. He demands answers that don't come from prayer alone. He writes in his own hand, and once a week he leaves a sealed note in the ledger she began. Sometimes she writes back, sometimes she just smiles. And Thalion, still loyal, still grumbling, still a step ahead of any noble who thinks a threat wears only armor. He's built a life around warning Meruan just before she's caught doing something brilliant. As for the queen, she watches her son grow sharper, the court grow quieter, the shadows shrink back from corners where once they ruled. She drinks from wooden cups now, and when she sips her evening tea, brewed from a blend Mehran made herself, she stares out toward the horizon, like someone waiting, not for battle but for peace. Because in the end, the war wasn't against poison, or fear, or even the past. It was against forgetting. And with every note the prince memorizes, every healer the infirmary trains, every life saved not by blessing but by understanding, the forgetting fades. Slowly, but permanently. You've made it to the end, dear listener. The stars have cooled, the pot has been cleaned, the woman who boiled stars has gone quiet, not because her work is done, but because, for once, others have taken up the flame. So now, let the hush of the night settle in. Let the last ember glow faint in your mind. Sit sigh, and know this even in the quietest corners of history, some truths simmer just below the surface, waiting for hands brave enough to stir them. Good night, sleep well.